The Left Hand of Darkness, 1969. On the distant planet of Gethin, an envoy named Genly I has the task of persuading its rulers to join the interstellar federation known as the Ecumen. Like Genly, the inhabitants of Gethin are human. Unlike him, they are of indeterminate sex. Only during the period known as Kema do they become sexually active, and each individual can be either male or female. Indeed, any one individual experiences periods of maleness and periods of femaleness throughout life. Accustomed to the strict gender demarcations of his own world, Genly finds the fluid sexuality of Gethin disconcerting, even disturbing, but he is most concerned with his diplomatic mission. His greatest ally appears to be a high-ranking politician in the kingdom of Karhide named Estraven, but Estraven is summarily dispatched into exile by his king. Genly soon follows him out of Karhide and arrives in a rival political state. There he is imprisoned, but eventually, after meeting Estraven once again, he escapes. Together, the envoy and the exiled politician make an epic voyage back to Karhide through the frozen and wintry landscape of Gethin. En route, Genly and Estraven, who enters Kema during the journey, form a deep and loving relationship which has only ended in tragic circumstances when they approach their goal. The Left Hand of Darkness is a remarkable novel for a number of reasons. In few SF narratives is an alien world conjured up so economically and poetically as Gethin is in Le Guin's book. Her lyrical descriptions of Genly and Estraven's winter journey across the planet are interwoven with the folktales recorded by the envoy, which subtly counterpoint his discoveries about Gethin and its people, and hint at an entire culture and civilization behind the events which the reader witnesses. The issues of gender and sexuality which the narrative raises are unmistakably important, but emerge easily and naturally from the story Le Guin is telling. There is no forced and strident preachifying in the pages of The Left Hand of Darkness, but rather a sophisticated awareness of the difficulties both characters face in their developing relationship. This novel is one of the most graceful, intelligent and thought-provoking examples of SF written from a feminist perspective. I found The Left Hand of Darkness incredibly moving when I read it, and it's certainly my favourite of Le Guin's books. It's obviously a very well-known book. I don't always go with a very well-known book as a favourite. In this case, this is my favourite, and I chose it for inclusion in my book 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels because I think really it sums up the reality that science fiction started exploring gender a long time ago. This book was published in the 1960s, and that all the talk now about gender in SF isn't exactly redundant because it's something that's been discussed a lot, but of course SF got there first and dealt with these issues in the 1960s and 1970s in a very broad, very specific and very literary way, and I think the works that look at gender from the 60s and 70s are far superior than what's going on now, if I'm honest. What you're seeing here, of course, is the classic Tim White cover, and this is the Orbit edition, and I used to sell this a lot in the 1980s in an A format, and as you see next to it in a demi format hardcover is the original SF Masterworks hardcover edition, which dates back to about 2020, and these are long out of print, very collectible, and this is one of the most beautiful ones, and I'm very glad they went with that lovely Tim White cover. And you see the difference in the coloration and the printing, both very beautiful, I think you'll agree. While we're on the subject of Ursula Le Guin, I think we may as well look at the Dispossessed as well. And this was one of very few authors who managed to get 2 books into 100 must-read science fiction novels. And I picked this one because of its importance to political SF. And The Dispossessed came out in 1974 and is subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia. And I think it's worth bearing in mind the ambiguity when you read this book. This is the Panther edition, which again I have very fond memories of selling from way back. And as I say, published in 1974. Is set on the planet Uras, which is a free market planet, mildly authoritarian and wealthy, which is orbited by the barren moon Anares. Now, Anares is an austere but successful society which practices an almost religious anarchism, and it feels almost like Buddhism at times. And it's developed on this arid satellite, with the individuals living there sharing goods as private property is virtually non-existent. The culture of Anaris was founded by Odo, a female political philosopher who fled with her followers from the laissez-faire capitalism of Uras. And I must say, when I read a few years ago, it must be about 10 years ago, Emma Newman's book, Planetfall, which has a cult led by a female leader, it did remind me of this quite a lot. Plot centres around a brilliant theoretical physicist called Shevek who resides on Anaris, but he finds that his groundbreaking work is being suppressed by his envious and doubtful colleagues. But his genius is really recognised by physics at the universities on Uras, so he's invited to lecture on the capitalist planet and to collect a significant academic award. Now on Uras, Shevek finds himself to be a celebrity, and he begins to question not only his own beliefs, but those of his hosts as well, and also their intentions. Which world is the true utopia? Is it Anaris or Uras? Is Anaris only seeking to exploit his knowledge? As Shevek debates these questions internally, he moves closer to confirming the principle of simultaneity, whose technological applications will lead to the invention of the Ansible, a device that will allow instantaneous communication over vast interstellar distances. The Ansible has become a trope within SF. Other people have employed it. And of course it relies on spooky action at a distance, quantum entanglement. And I say this is a book from 1974, so you can see that Le Guin was engaged not just with the politics, but also with the physics as well. Many people say they find The Dispossessed a very dry book, and I completely understand that. When I first tried to read it, I didn't get on with it at all. It felt too much like a sociological text. And then I stepped back and looked at it again in a different mood, and I absolutely loved it, and I now think it's a masterwork. It's a first-rate political meditation, and it's a philosophical character study, and it uses SF as the perfect arena to explore different theories of what would make for an ideal society. This really confirmed Le Guin's position as the greatest female SF writer to date, and this is the masterpiece, which is the ultimate utopian novel in modern literature, I feel. It doesn't offer any easy answers. The questions it poses are hard ones, but it's thoughtful, rewarding, and it's a book which examines that eternal question of the grass always seeming greener on the other side. As we're looking at female writers today in this episode of 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, I thought I'd show you some books on the Women's Press science fiction series from the 1980s. And the book I'm specifically going to talk about at more length is The Female Man by Joanna Russ, which these days is a Golax masterwork, and I would say is my favourite pure feminist SF novel. Also next to that you see is The Adventures of Alex, and these are around in the mid-80s, and these are A-format paperbacks. After a while they became B-format larger paperbacks, and they've got this very sober livery of grey. And the fact is that I don't recall many women buying them at the time. Now, it could just be that was the case in the bookshops I was working with. And Women's Press published books only by women. And as you see, this is a anthology of short stories about Alex, including Russ's first novel, Picnic on Paradise. There is a more complete edition of this, I believe, or it could be that this is the more complete, I can't recall. But Picnic on Paradise is great fun. It's certainly worth picking up. And it has a kind of sword and sorcery feel. If you like Gene Wolfe, I would say you'd probably like it. But to talk about The Female Man, that's what we want to do next. Joanna Russ was born in 1937 in the USA, and she died some years ago. The Female Man was first published in 1975. So that's some years before the go-to obvious feminist SF novel, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. And as I'm always telling people in my job, people seem to think that was the first feminist dystopia, utopia, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't. The key work in feminist SF was mostly performed in the 1970s. So what is The Female Man about? It's about four women who experience life in very different ways in four parallel worlds. In one world, not radically dissimilar to contemporary America, Joanna suffers from male oppression and condescension, and it's worth mentioning there, of course, that Joanna is the name of our author. Janine lives in a reality that seems like a paradigm of male fantasies about earlier days when women knew their place and the relationships between the sexes were uncomplicated by female demands for equality. The Second World War has not taken place, and the country is still suffering from the effects of the Great Depression. So as you see, the second narrative has an alternative history, making it already a very interesting book for the reader. In the third paradigm in the novel, The Planet Whileaway features a woman called Janet who lives in a female-only society where men are both absent and unmissed. The fourth character is Jael, aka Alice Reasoner, a cyborg man-killer from a dystopian future in which men and women living separately in manland and womanland engage in constant warfare. As the boundaries between these four parallel worlds break down, Russ charts the interactions between the women, each possessing a personality shaped by the society in which she lives. Feminist writers produced some of the most inventive and challenging SF of the 1970s, as women staked their claims in a genre that had long been dominated by men. Joanna Russ proved to be one of the most outspoken and uncompromising female writers who emerged in SF in the late 60s and early 70s, and The Female Man, which can prove uncomfortable reading for any man, is a novel that boldly and readily and needfully challenges all the preconceptions about gender and the natural relationship between the sexes. Using science fiction to undermine conventional thinking and to imagine alternatives, Joanna Russ creates an angry, bitterly comic work of fiction that turns a series of reflecting mirrors on oppressive and patriarchal societies. Through the experiences of the four everywomen, she charts both the injustice of the present day and potential paths towards liberation, and she does so in very compelling narratives that demand the attention of the readers. Russ produced quite a number of really good books, and they're not always easy reading. In the late 70s she produced We Who Are About To, which to my way of thinking does owe a certain debt to Charles Logan's Shipwreck. But it's very uncompromising. There's a nice Penguin paperback in the Penguin World series available of that, and I would urge you to read that. It's about a spaceship crash and a survival situation on an alien planet, and that's well worth a look as well. Russ has also recently been canonised in Library of America with this novels and stories collection. Hopefully that there'll be another one, because And Chaos Died, her new wave novel, isn't really present in this. This includes The Female Man, We're About To, her mainstream novel On Strike Against God, which is really interesting, the complete Alex stories, and some other stories as well. I say canonised because as much as I like Library of America, they do have this habit of only publishing people who fit the narrative or who are now accepted into mainstream literature, usually because they're dead, because they are of colour, or because they're female. And that sounds politically incorrect, but if you look at the SF writers they publish, they're very comfortable with Bradbury, Vonnegut, Russ, Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin, Philip K. Dick. These are people who have all become canonised either through film versions of their work. Popular acclaim for Bradbury as a stylist goes way, way back. The same for Vonnegut, who was very quick to disassociate himself from SF, and for feminist writers and writers of colour, though strangely they are yet to do anything with Samuel R. Delany, though I suspect there may be licensing issues there. I would like to see Lower do a lot more with SF. They've done two really good anthologies, but I do think that they're box ticking, and I really think they should show the genre a bit more respect and not just go with writers whose time has come. And sadly, Russ is still not read widely enough. The number of people who read The Handmaid's Tale who really should read The Female Man, the difference between those two numbers is just staggering and a bit sad, really. Just to give you an idea of the sort of authors the women's press were publishing in their SF line in the 1980s, here on the left we have Josephine Saxton's Queen of the States, and Josephine Saxton was a British writer born in 1935, produced quite a number of SF novels and stories. She's pretty much forgotten these days. This is a very interesting one where states refers both to a state of mind and a place. Interesting political story with lots of SF overtones and character development that was really enjoyable. In the centre we have what is now a really famous book, which quite frankly at the time nobody was interested in, and Harlan Ellison of course helped support Octavia Butler financially and get to where she needed to be. And Kindred is now of course a classic. I'm going to talk about that again at some point, because it's one of those books that when you read, even looking back at it, you feel the rest of the world looking over your shoulder. So I'll have something to say about that again. And then on the right, this is not a women's press book, but this is somebody who was published in women's press, who I didn't read at the time. I always thought was interesting. And that's Suzette Haden Elgin. And this is the Communipath Worlds omnibus, 3 novels. There were 5 books in this series, and I did show this in the early days of the channel. I brought it back up again because Richard at Vintage SF has read one of these novels recently, and I think he read the first one, which is called, no, he read the second one, which is Furthest. The first one was called The Communipaths, the third one is at the 7th level, and these are about a galactic federation where there are telepaths, but they can only sort of communicate via a relay. Their thoughts can only go so far, and that actually is a scene from one of the books, and I think it's at the 7th level, where wars are fought. Rival sides use poetry, and artificial intelligence, that's the clunky looking machine in the background, decides who's won, which is really amusing. They are feminist, but they're very subtle, so they can be read without one feeling that you're having polemic poked at you all the time. And there's the 4th book in the sequence, Star Anchored, Star Angered, in Door, which I think you'll agree is very beautiful. And I think that was the first one I read. And I do like Elgin. I think she's underrated. She died a few years ago, which is a great shame. And her book, which was published in women's press, was this one. This obviously is a Gollancz masterwork. This is Native Tongue, which was also published in a B format like this one by women's press. They shifted from A to B in about 87, and I didn't read it at the time. And there was a sequel called Judas Rose. I think Native Tongue came out in about 1984, and it's a book about linguistics and aliens, and it's back in print now, and I really recommend it. It's set about 200 years from now, and women don't have many rights. It's a repressive patriarchal society, and women are, however, very good at being translators for interstellar travel, and they are selectively bred for this reason and kept in a kind of house which is separate to everybody else. Unfortunately, in that house, they're beginning to develop a new language all of their own that will free them from the domination of men. And this is interesting because it refers in a way to Samuel R. Delaney's thoughts about how science fiction is mostly about language and how language limits perception. So do watch out for Native Tongue. It's not widely stocked. Le Guin loved it. I think it's a really interesting book. I'm personally probably fonder of the Coyote Jones stories in these, which are a little bit more naive and simplistic, but arguably more successful. But Native Tongue is well worth your attention. So these are the kind of books which women's press were doing in the 1980s. But as I say, I'm not sure many women were buying them. I certainly didn't have that experience. So if you were one of the women who bought these books and read them, please make a comment below. Or if you're one of the men who bought them, please make a comment. This is Stephen E. Andrews, Outlaw Bookseller, signing out from this episode of 100 Must Read Science Fiction Novels. Bye for now.